歡迎來到民視台灣學堂哲學堂淺淺的節目，我是今天的主持人葉浩。今天來跟我們一起聊哲學的是一個非常特別的來賓。我們這個節目通常是跟一般大眾介紹主要的哲學問題以及思想家，但是我們今天有一位真正的哲學家，他幾乎從來不上專訪，而且很少，幾乎不可能會上電視節目。那我們今天很高興請到了來自英國的法學教授 Professor Joseph Ross。那我們今天要跟他一起聊他個人的思想。那我們希望在接下來的1個小時左右的專訪，能夠讓他講述清楚他自己的理論，因為目前有非常非常多的，不管是政治學界或法學界的學者們都在研究他的思想。那我們現在要開始進行他的專訪。First of all, thank you very much for coming, Professor Ross. Okay, this is a program meant to introduce key concepts and key philosophers, but this is the first time we have the chance to introduce a major political philosopher in person. So, welcome to our program.
Hello.
Okay, so now let me go straight to the question. As you may have noticed already, people in Taiwan regard you as a law professor, or more specifically, a jurisprudence scholar. But in some small circle, people also consider you as a political philosopher. So my first question would be, how do you normally understand the relation between law and politics, and how you understand political philosophy and philosophy of law in general?
I think we normally think of the law in 3 ways. On the one hand, there is a set of institutions which are identifying the law as legal institutions. They include the courts, the police, prisons, parliament, government, executive branch, administrative bodies, and there are some bodies which have a kind of half-life, half public legal bodies and half not. They are usually more autonomous, but also fulfilling governmental functions. Right. So there's no sharp divide between the legal institutions and the other, but some of them are very clear, like parliament, courts, police, executive and government. Second way we think about the law is the set of standards, rules, principles which guide the activities of those organizations, the legal institutions, and of everybody else, and which are normally the product of the activities of those institutions, enforced and applied, interpreted, and developed by those institutions, regarded by them as binding them and binding the population at large. And then beyond that, there is a web of attitudes and practices and beliefs towards the first 2 elements which I mentioned, the institution and the standard. And one way or another, this is what the law is. Now, politics. There possibly are more definitions or more disagreements about what politics is and about law, but one narrow way of identifying politics are those actions and the standards and principles which guide them, which are meant to affect the activities of the legal institutions, affect parliament, affect the government, affect the police, affect the laws, the standards which they produce and apply. So that's a very familiar, ordinary understanding of politics. And of course, once you stated it, the relation between law and politics is self-explanatory. There are other definitions of politics, broader definition of politics as having to do with attempts to affect actions and policies which have an impact on the population at large, on the public good and so on. But we can stick with my narrower definition, because it brings out the close relations between law and politics into sight.
Yeah.
You asked about philosophy of law and political philosophy. Now, I think, and many people think, that philosophy of law is just part of political philosophy. And I personally don't care for classifications and boundaries very much. I think they are helpful at an introductory level, but once you move on, you can disregard them and think about the substance of the issues. So it's a matter of more or less. There are some parts of political philosophy which require legal knowledge, understanding of legal institutions and how they work, and the theory of legal institutions, how they work, is legal philosophy, that part of political philosophy, which not every political philosopher would have the knowledge to engage in or the interest to deal with. But other parts of legal philosophy are just about the general way in which those institutions should work. And that is what political philosophy is about as well. Principles of justice, of fairness, of humanity, when the institutions should act with forgiveness, and so on and so forth. And that's...
I see. Thank you very much. And you use the word binding, and but you haven't used the word normative or norms. Now, I'd like to bring in another dimension, which is a moral one. I'd like to know, how do you consider the relationship between morality and law and politics? That's even much more complicated. And perhaps we can start from discussing the issue of civil disobedience. A few years ago, there's a student movement occurring in Taiwan, and quite a lot of people use or refer to your name and use your view on civil disobedience in the public debate. So I'd like to know if you reject civil disobedience on principle, outright on principle, or you think there must be some conditions that must be met in order to for someone to carry out civil disobedience for them to be legitimate. So what's your opinion?
I will not evade this, but I want to say, you mentioned that I didn't use the word normative or norms. I didn't because I thought there are more terms, technical terms. They're of course used in everyday language, but when philosophers use them, they use them as technical terms, which are very useful. I use them all the time, but we don't have to use them. And when we talk to non-professionals, we better not use them too much.
I see.
We can, they are just, for professionals, they are shorthands. But everything that we say with their use can be said without them.
I see.
And even in professional discussion, it's better to remain without technical terms as long as you can. Sometimes it becomes too complicated, and to simplify, you use technical terms. Another preliminary is that I tend not to talk about, not to express views about events or movements in any specific country. And it's not because I have no such views, and it's not because I don't think that citizens, including academics, should engage in politics. It is simply because informed opinion on concrete events requires much more than understanding of principles. It requires understanding of complex factual situations. And people in my field of work are not experts in this regard. And sometimes there's a risk that they will rush to apply principle in a rather simple-minded way. So in a way, if in this forum you ask, you didn't, but if you were to ask me to express opinion about a particular thing, I will be abusing the situation, I will be using an occasion in which I'm regarded as an expert to talk about things that I'm not an expert in.
Right.
So I will avoid this. But I will tell you about civil disobedience. I have no objection of principle to civil disobedience at all.
Oh, really?
I have only views about how it is possible and good to argue for and against civil disobedience, and how we should not argue about civil disobedience. And those views start from belief that people generally have a right to engage in political action, and that right should be recognized in law. What does it mean that they have a right to engage in political action? It means that they're entitled to express their views and to act to have an impact on politics, on legal and political policies and outcomes, try to change them, try to improve them, try to affect them any way they think. And they can do this as a matter of right. That is, they don't have to say, my views are correct, and that is why I'm entitled to do it. Whether the views are correct or incorrect, good or bad, they have a right to engage in political opinion and to push for causes that they think are right, but which may not be, and they don't have to prove that they are correct in thinking that they are right. Now, of course, there is a limit to everything, but the limits on the right to engage in political action are identified by the type of activities you're entitled to do, not by the soundness of your views. So the limit will not be you are entitled to advocate for good causes but not for bad causes. The limit will be you are entitled to write, to express your views, to march, to organize petitions, to vote, to organize political parties, to picket, lots of other things. You are not entitled to kill people, maim people, wantonly destroy property, and lots of other things. So the things which are excluded are by type of action because of bad consequences that they have. But they are limited with the idea that what is not limited is free, regardless of whether you're right or not. Now, suppose that we have a country, let's call it U for utopia, or L for liberal. And in that country, they have laws which recognize correctly the rights of people to engage in political activity. So the legal rights to engage in political activity coincide with the moral right, which is what I was talking about. Now, some people think that they want to engage in political activity outside the bound of the right that they have. By definition, it's civil disobedience, it's against the law. But in our country, the country we imagine, it's also against their moral right. It's not against the moral right, but it's beyond their moral right to engage in political activity, because the limits of the law are exactly the limits of morality. We assume it. Does it mean that they are not justified in doing political disobedience? It doesn't. It just means that the justification has to be different. They have to justify what they are doing by pointing to the rightness of the cause, which ordinary political activity does not rely on. Of course, all political activity aims at promoting some causes, but the right to do so does not depend on those causes being the correct causes to promote. The civil disobedience in our ideal country, ideal from that point of view, has to show that the cause he is promoting, for the sake of which he is occupying parliament buildings or doing other things that are not allowed, is just, and he has to come to show other things which will vindicate his action. And there are many cases of justified civil disobedience based on the justice of the cause, on the atrocities that they fight against. which allows them to go beyond the right and in this special way. Now, what happens in other countries which are not so good? There, the limits of political action, the legal limits, are much narrower than the moral limits.
I see.
And there are people who engage in civil disobedience, maybe breaking the law, but not going outside their moral right to engage in political activity. And they are entitled to engage in civil disobedience to that extent, regardless of the justice of their cause. So how much and how to argue about civil disobedience depends on how good the law about political engagement is, whether it conforms to the moral right or does not.
You make distinctions between different types of activities, and you also mentioned that people have right to engage politics. So you don't make sharp distinctions between moral rights or political rights or legal rights.
I make a sharp distinction between a moral right and a legal right.
Legal rights, yeah, but not political right.
Political right is moral right.
I see. Okay, that's what I'm asking. Okay, that's great. So, when you say the ideal type of society, which you say the L society, I guess you mean liberal or ideal liberal society, or maybe democratic society. So, in this kind of mature, open, and liberal democratic societies, people's right to engage civil disobedience is quite limited. That's what you say. But any other specific criterions by which we can judge whether a society is a good liberal, good democratic society?
Sure. But it's not a straightforward action. There is no script in the sky which we can read and say, is it like that? We have to remember that what matters is how people fare in the societies in which they live. Other people outside the society may be affected by what you do in your own country. Other animals, other than human animals, may be affected. So all that has to be taken into account. But to simplify and remain only with a complicated question, not too complicated. So we stay just about what matters in a society is just that the government actions will be for the benefit of the people in that country. And then the question is, what can governments do which will be in the benefit of the people? Sometimes, with the very best intentions, they overreach. They do things which no government can succeed in. So we need to understand the nature, the structure of government, which sets limits, and the conditions of the country, which set limits to what governments can do. And then we have to prioritize among the things that they can do, which are the more important, which things government can do but can be done, can happen for the benefit of people without governmental intervention, and focus government in those areas where its intervention and activity is really high priority to benefit people in the society. So it depends a lot on which country we are talking, at what time, what condition it is, and how those very general considerations would apply. There you come with different answers in different places.
Right, you put great trust in government. And I think what you say is a good democratic society is one open to the people, or open to people who would like to express their opinions. But in some societies, even open democratic societies, there are always some minority people who may have some access to express their opinions, but they are actually the permanent minorities. And in that case, what can we do about them? Just simply because this is a good constitutional democratic society already. So they do their best. They try to express their opinions and try to convince other people, but they can't win anyway. So in that situation, what can we do?
So I think your question makes two important points. One is that democracy is not a magic cure to all the problems that people face. That even in a decent democracy, there would be inadequacies in the structure of the government which might leave some people unjustly treated or in dire conditions. Many theorists try to cope with this problem by tweaking the notion of democracy so that democracy will be equal with the best of all possible government, but it will have no shape, no internal coherence. It will be an amalgam of different solutions to different problems with the title democracy at the top. If we keep democracy to the idea of responsiveness to the settled opinions of the people in the country, responsiveness by the government so that it can change and adjust its activities in light of the views of people in society, then we need more than just a democratic structure to solve the problem that you mentioned. And the second point that you make, related point that you make in your question, is that we shouldn't always think about more democracy, less democracy, and so on. When we are discussing, we should think about the problems, as you did, and deal with the solution. And the solutions will be different depending on which minorities there are. Sometimes the plight of the people will be plight of groups of people which, even though they are a minority, they really don't want to be a minority. That is, they want full integration. They want to be treated like everybody else.
See, yes.
And in this case, non-discrimination laws and education, the cultivation of a culture of non-discrimination may be the best solution to the problem. Doesn't work overnight, but over time it may be the best way to do it. And sometimes it can work quite quickly.